now live on Facebook. So today's demo is glazes in acrylics. What is a glaze? What is a glaze? It is a thin layer. Sometimes in oils it could be called scumbles. So a glaze is where you've got a previous colour laid down and then you glaze a transparent wash of another colour over. So in watercolours you can glaze, in oils you can glaze, and in acrylics you can glaze. If you think with watercolours for a second, when you put one colour down it's called a wash, but if you put a transparent wash over another, that becomes a glaze. And in acrylics it's the same, and in oils it's the same. I use glazes in loads of different ways. For example, here's one I did earlier. So in this painting, it's a very dull day, maybe a bit rainy, what have you. Keep knocking that camera. What I want to do is make it feel misty. So in making it misty, I want to push those mountains, those hills back. So I can do that by glazing. So if I get a brush, dilute some titanium white. Now when you're working with acrylics you have to dilute them on your palette first, otherwise you get lumps. Now I'm using Sennelier abstract acrylics which dilute down really well to a good ink, and you want it like a milky consistency or an inky consistency. And then if I glaze over, it seems quite strong at first, but I'm moving it about. If you do too much water, it won't work. But can you see how that's pushed that right back? Almost non-existent, you know, it's softened it a lot. Now if I, apologies Facebook, I'm going to put a hairdryer on just for a second. Off camera, look at this, how skilled am I? You can build, hello Vanessa, welcome. So each layer can be built up. And because you're using the same colour, that's fine. So I want to push that one further back. So I'll just put another glaze of white over it. And maybe down here, so we've got a bit of a lingering mist. So can you see how soft that's become? And it's become misty. What else I can do will change the whole concept of this picture. Hello Julie. Hairdryer, sorry. We can make it rain. If I want this to be a rainy, stormy scene, we can make it rain with a glaze. If I get a really old fan brush that is, it's been around a bit, this fan brush, it's got less bristles than, it's basically a stick with a few bits of hair. But if I wet that and then go into my watercolour white, my watercolour version of acrylic, so my inky glaze of titanium white, an extra blob. If I sort of bring this now in a sort of diagonal brush stroke.
You must have a very steady hand with this.
Yes.
To make them parallel.
Yeah, otherwise you get sort of yes, you've got lovely wobbly lines then. But can you see how that's changed the scene now? It's sort of, now it's a bit too thick. It's also really good for smoke coming from a chimney or what have you. That works really well. Now you don't want to overdo it because otherwise it'll just block in white and you've basically just glazed over the whole painting. But now we've got a really rainy, stormy sea rather than just a storm brewing. It's actually... Hello Lee, welcome. I thought you were watching the rugby this morning from Facebook, but welcome anyway. So that is how you can change a painting. You can add glaze with mist. I did a whole painting of sort of like about 3 or 4 layers of Snowdonia Mountains, and I did a glaze over all. I painted them dark because that's the sorry Facebook. That's the issue with a lot of these things, is if you want to create a mountain in the mist, if you add white to a mountain, to the grey, it no longer becomes a dark grey, it just is a pale grey. So if you paint the pale grey, let it dry and add a glaze over it, it becomes a dark grey in the mist. So that's the difference. That's where glazing works well. And if you think in the Renaissance or late Renaissance, where they're doing lace, and in the Tudor period, they'd paint the skin tone first, then with a white glaze over the top, you get that semi-transparent feel of lace. So that's how that works. So this you can build up if you wanted it to be rainier or less rainy. But for me, this has made this painting far more dramatic because it's now got... Otherwise, it's just a boat, isn't it? It's just a boat on some sea, which is nice, but a bit boring. But now we've got a bit of mist, we've got some rain coming in, and the water makes sense. It's a bit choppy now. The seagulls have all gone because they don't want to hang around. I'll pass this round so you can have a look now. Start with you, Tony. And it's the same with this picture, what I did earlier. Now, the background here is the same colour as the midground. So that actually flattens my landscape. Whereas a white glaze...
Just mix it with water.
Just water, yeah, just white and water. Now if I put that just on these background trees to about here, instantly I've gained a quarter of a mile. But they're still the same tone. You know that they're grey trees. I could, if I wished, just soften that a little bit more. If you use too much water, you end up with bubbles, and that doesn't work. So you really want to work the bristles and the paint in with the background. And it's the same as here. You see, this is far behind, so I'll just mist that. And because you're using a dilute white, it will just disappear into the sky, because your sky is quite pale. But for me, this is an absolute essential to any landscape. And it does mean that it gives you far more control over your work, because you can push things back but retain the strength of colour, but you're softening the colour. Sometimes in watercolours I do it with pastel, a white pastel. If I've done a background that's too strong, I'll use white pastel and soften it, and that does exactly the same thing. It creates the effect of a glaze. But that has changed that whole scene.
It's loved by the tree, it's perfect.
Yeah, and it brings that tree forward, and it pushes that back. Whereas if I just left it, yeah,
Same sort of thing.
yeah, exactly. So now we've got a lot more. This is my lane when it was really snowy, actually. And I think this snow scene was a demo piece that I did, and I just dug it back out again because I wanted to add a bit to it today. And just that one wash makes a difference. For example, with a glaze, if you've got a field system, and you can glaze in watercolours in this same way, and you put it all the same green background and then put your hedgerows in, you can then glaze with various shades of yellows and browns and greens each field, and make each field an individual one rather than all the same tone. Just little subtle glazes make a huge difference, and it's these things that add extra depth and a more, it's like ups your game a bit, because it shows, like we said off camera, that you're understanding how the paint works. And a lot of people won't notice. They'll look at your work and they won't know that you've done that, because you can't tell that I've glazed. But we know I have, because you've just seen it, and that has pushed that back. But too much water and you'll get bubbles, so it does take a bit of practice. If you do get bubbles on it, the best thing you can do is dry your brush and go back over it again. On canvas, it does highlight the canvas texture, but you can sort of soften it a little bit. But if I pass that around now. So the other thing you can do, there we go, that's better, with glazes, if I just bring this one out a little bit, will it fit in my little bit here? Right, so this beast, in full glorious Technicolor, is all created by glazing. There's not a single colour applied until the last layer. This is one of the oldest methods of painting in oils, because it's the cheapest. Pigment, artist quality pigment, if you've seen downstairs in the shop, is really expensive. Because it's proper, and it will last for hundreds and hundreds of years, 500, 600, 700 years if you buy the real pigment. But because it's so expensive, you don't want to use much of it. So artists developed a way of glazing, and the way you do it is you use the two cheapest colours available, which is black and white. You paint the whole painting in black and white. Now, I did have a discussion with an art group a while back who said you should never use black. Rubbish. Absolute rubbish. It was the main colour of every artist throughout the whole Middle Ages, early, mid and late Renaissance, because it was the most obtainable through charcoal or soot or something. It's accessible. You've got chalk and you've got charcoal. That's your black and your white. Grind it down, add your egg white, egg yolk, or your paint or whatever, and you've got paint. So if you can mix and paint an image in grayscale, modern cameras are wonderful, because you can, especially a smartphone, you can take a photograph in colour and then you can save a separate version of that in grayscale. It is very hard, and my admiration goes to the Renaissance artists who could see tones in black and white, because, you know, it's difficult, isn't it? So the photograph I've worked from is that fruit bowl, and I then printed it off in black and white and matched the tones. Some people find that really hard to do, to match versions of grey. That has a double meaning. A, it will improve your painting, but B, it will help you understand tone a huge amount better. With fruit, I've chosen this as an example because really an orange circle in a bowl is an orange, a yellow curve in a bowl is a banana, and a red circle in a bowl is an apple, isn't it? You can get away with that, but when you learn to paint in grayscale, how do you make the red of... It's like watching snooker on a black and white telly, isn't it? It's very, very difficult. You know, which is, and he's potting the red ball now. Is it red? It looks black to me. And it's that sort of thing. But that took quite a while to get the tones right based on the black and white image. And I've spent longer on this. You need to get your tonal values right, otherwise your glazing won't work. And you might think, but if I'm putting transparent colours over this, it's not going to do anything because it's transparent. But what you have to imagine is that colour is never totally transparent. It is semi-transparent. And you can work how much water to paint with your ratios. So if it is too transparent, just use less water and a bit more paint, and that makes it a little bit more opaque. For example then, let me find a little fiddly brush. So I was saying, I only use a few brushes, and I do only use a few brushes, but they get lost in this melee of brushes, and I don't know where they all go. It's an old brush. So, for example, the banana. I will go in with actually quite cadmium yellow, not as lemon yellow as you would think. So if I go in with, sorry camera, you've got my arm and you're not seeing what I'm doing. How about if I do this? I'd hate for you to miss out. Right, here we go. This is the consistency you want. You want it like ink. In fact, you could use ink, but then that's not really glazing. It's, you know, glazing is when you dilute a paint to make a glaze. You can glaze in cakes and all sorts. It's that dilution of a medium over the top of another. So here, if I glaze over the top, where the shading is darker, it will darken the glaze. Where the shading is lighter, it will leave the shade lighter. This is amazing. Some people don't like painting in this. For me, it's wonderful because it does two things. If I'm trying to shade a banana, as you do, what tones do you use? How do you get a yellow dark without it going brown? Or how do you pale it? How do you lighten it without it going too milky? Because it's not, it's light and dark. And amazingly, by having the shade already there in grayscale, it does it for you. You don't need to add a light and a dark because it's already there. Let's go with a Granny Smith there. That's a bit of cadmium yellow. See, I'm doing it again. Hang on, let's come down here. A little bit of cadmium yellow, a little bit of cerulean blue. Perfect Granny Smith colour. And again, I need to dilute it enough for that semi-transparency. Now, this doesn't mean highlights. There are highlights on here, but when the glazes are dry, I will put my white spots back in. So this isn't the finished article. And I can put 2 or 3 layers on if I need to. Or even glaze again with more colour. But you can see that's a 3D apple now. Isn't it amazing? I just love it. I get so excited by this. A little sad, I know. But if there's nothing on telly, this is how to occupy your mind. Just paint something in black and white. Now, you can't do this in watercolour. Sorry about that. Just in case to build your hopes up. Now, the only reason is, when you glaze with watercolour, you have to do it very, very quickly, because with acrylics or oils or egg tempera, the undercolour dries waterproof. So you can wash and do all this, but with watercolour, it never ever dries. So if I did a beautiful black and white drawing, I would lift up the black and it would get muddy. What you could do, however, is you could do a grayscale drawing in a harder pencil, not a soft pencil, and then glaze with watercolour over the top, and that will give you that 3-dimensional quality, just so you can see how it works. It does work best in more traditional, well, watercolour's traditional, but you know what I mean, more of a thick style paint, more of an opaque paint.
And for the black and white, you use just acrylic black and white.
Yeah, just acrylic black and white. And you could do, if you're working in oils, you could actually do an acrylic black and white first and then glaze with oils over the top. It will then sell for more because it's an oil painting with acrylic underpainting, you see, which makes it. Right, so I've mixed a bit of crimson and, well, carmine and cadmium red here for this dark apple. It's good practice for not going over the lines, which I've just done. But you wouldn't think it would work, and it does. But if you look at how little paint I am using to create the colour of an object, you know, I've got thumbnail pieces of paint on my palette and I won't use anywhere near that. I could do a whole painting, and I have done whole paintings, and you don't need hardly any colour. So you can see why these guys did this, because it's so economical and it's solid. The Queen up there, for Facebook reference, it's like I'm on the radio. People of Facebook, I've just pointed to a painting I did of the Queen. She was painted in black and white first. She was painted in grayscale, and then flesh tones and the clothing tones applied as glazes over the top. And it makes it more solid, rather than painting a flesh tone and trying to darken flesh tone without it going green or purple or grey or black or brown in the wrong places. It won't work. But if you do a grayscale drawing or painting underneath and then apply transparent flesh tones and then add your highlights, it makes a huge difference to a painting. So let's go with a bit more cadmium red, because we've got more of an orangey red here. So I'll go with a little bit of cadmium yellow with my cadmium red. Go over this apple here. So where the white is showing through, it makes your paint lighter. Follow the contours though, don't just slap the paint on, because you're not going to hide where these lines are. And there's a little bit of green inside there. Let's use a bit of Granny Smith green over there. And then you can double glaze. So there's a bit of that Granny Smith that I want just a little bit lighter. I might use some lemon actually. But it's really important when you're mixing your glaze that you make it really dilute and you get rid of all the lumps of paint in your bristles, because then you're not going to glaze. So maybe have a brush for making the glaze and then a brush for glazing. That makes life a bit easier. So if I glaze with a little bit of lemon yellow just over the top of that apple, I've got more solidity to the object. And then here we've got another quite a yellowy Granny Smith. He's eating that one. So I'm using a number 4 filbert. Filberts are quite good for glazing, because you wouldn't know because it's an old filbert, but a filbert brush is different to a flat and it's different to a round. With a flat brush, you're always going to get points and lines. With a round brush, you're always going to get V shapes. But with a filbert, because it's curved, it actually blends really well. So we've got 3. Oh, there's a lime there. I missed that lime. Let's do that lime. So we'll do a lime, quite citrusy, with lemon yellow and cerulean, because they're both green based. Not that green, Barry. Goodness, what you are. It's very very limey, isn't it? We'll go with that. Okay, and then we'll make our orange colour from a lot of cadmium yellow, a little bit of cadmium red, because the cadmium red is orange based and the cadmium yellow is orange based, so there we will get a nice bright orange. All of this information is available on my book on Amazon for £6. So there's not a colour that doesn't work when you apply a glaze to it. Sometimes the orange can go a bit green, but if you put 2 layers on, so this is the same colour, but because this is greyer, the orange looks darker. So then, what you do, move that out of the way because I don't want to get to dry it up too much with the hairdryer. Each layer has to dry before you can put another layer on. It just is better that way. If you're impatient, do use a hairdryer, because what will happen even with acrylics is if you're putting a wet layer on top of a damp or semi-dry layer, you will lift off that layer and then you lose that solidity. So we'll go back with some white, and then all I need to do is just reaffirm my white spots. As a glaze. A little bit of reflected light in there. Let's just clean my brush. So glazing is just such a wonderful way of getting to know your work and sort of understanding, you know, do I need a lot of colour or can I get away with a little bit of colour? Now, looking at that, you wouldn't know that that had been painted in any other way other than black and white. You may get to the point where you actually love your black and white painting so much that you don't want to paint over it. But it adds so much more depth if you do that. And if I show you a completed piece with the background in, so that was black and white. But you've got that solidity. Now, for an apple colour, because it's a green, how do you lighten a green, how do you darken a green, and varying tones of green without it going a funny colour? Well, with glazing, you don't have to do that because you've got your lights and your darks already. And in fact, I've just spotted, where's my brush gone? There's a hint of a reflected colour off that apple on that Granny Smith. So I can do that as a glaze of reflected light just on there, so it makes the apple feel like it's reflected. It's just, honestly, I would encourage you all to try it, no matter what medium you try. If you're in watercolours, do a pencil sketch and glaze over. It may pick up some of the pencil, so you still have to work quite quickly, which is why I said a harder pencil will have less removal. A soft pencil will will sort of like, it will come up with the paint. But work with acrylics. I know you were saying you struggled with acrylics earlier. This way you won't struggle, because you can just paint in black and white. You know, that is something that anybody could do with practice. It may not work well straight away, but black and white tone, and then all you do is mix up a colour in your palette, dilute it, paint over it, and it's sorted. What else? It doesn't just have to be a black and white painting, and plenty of artists do it this way. Look, if I have here, I've got an ultramarine leaf and a cadmium yellow leaf. When I do this, I always panic, because I think, what if it doesn't work this week? If I then glaze my cadmium yellow over my ultramarine, I've created a green that actually doesn't exist, because you're overlaying colours. And if I do the same with my ultramarine, I'm cleaning my brush, Barry. Over the cadmium yellow, it creates a different shade of green. So whatever the colour is underneath becomes the dominant colour. But I've got two shades of green now that haven't actually been mixed. You can create mixes by just overlaying glazes, and sometimes that's a really good way of exploring the colour. I know an artist from up north, and he uses watercolours, but he uses wine glasses pre-mixed, and he uses cadmium yellow, ultramarine, crimson, and a mix of the crimson and the ultramarine to make a purple. And by applying glazes in succession, so he might put yellow down, and then when he puts the yellow down and when he puts the purple on top, he gets brown. But when he puts the ultramarine on top of that yellow, he gets green. And you know, you can play around with your glazes, so you're not mixing on the palette, you're mixing on the paper, and that gives some really interesting quality. But again, with watercolours, you do have to be quick, because it will dry, and it will lift off. But even with leaves like this, you can work on your complementary colours. If I want to change that tone, if I use a bit of crimson on it, it will soften and subdue that green and make it more of a subdued natural green. Even if I use it with this one to a degree, it will work. Totally different feel. I've deadened it, I've softened it. So if you get vibrant colours, Constable used to do this, but not as a glaze. When he was painting trees, he would put blobs of red around the tree to make it vibrant. But if you glaze red over a green, because they're complementary, it deadens it. So if you do a green that is really quite vibrant and you think, oh, that's not very natural, let it dry and just glaze a thin layer of red over it. Either red works. I prefer crimson over cad red. Cad red can make it a bit more autumnal. But a very thin glaze of crimson over your green will soften it. It's the same as if you've got a yellow that is really vibrant, soften it with a glaze of purple. Or if you've got a blue that is very vibrant, soften it with a glaze of orange. I'll show you. Let's go with a bit of ultramarine. I might have to put the hairdryer on this to get it to dry. So because this is blue, I will glaze with orange. So this kind of fits in with the last demo I did on colour harmonies. Whereas this time we are glazing to create harmony, or to subdue, or to soften. But it's amazing how that crimson has just pushed that green away a little bit. So let's go with some of the orange colour that I've got from doing those clementines. Over the blue. And it just takes the vibrancy out of it and makes it a bit softer. The complementary for ultramarine is actually cadmium yellow, which is that, but we're doing it in a slightly different way. So you can see how glazes make a difference to a picture, and this black and white thing, if you can get to grips with it, will work. You can do landscapes in it, you can do portraits in it, you can do still life in it. Doesn't matter what you do, you'll work out the shape, the tone, the form with the black and white, which is what you want to do. You'll appreciate everything about it, and then all you're doing on top of that is glazing one single colour or a mix of colours, but then you can apply another glaze over the top, let it dry. But you're using no colour at all. I've used hardly any of the colour that I've squeezed out because it's economical, but you've got that solidity. That fruit bowl looks like a bowl of fruit, but that was black and white an hour ago, even 30 minutes ago. And then you put your white highlights on top. If you wanted to do more, because there are a few white spots, don't glaze. And just use the white neat. But sparingly, and that just brings it forward a little bit more than it would normally. So basically that is how to glaze with acrylics or oils or watercolours. A glaze is a transparent wash of colour over another colour. Doesn't matter what colour it is, it will change it. And in fact, if you've got if you wanted to play an experiment, and I know you like to do that, Charlotte, if you put a stripe of ultramarine down, let it dry, and then glaze all of the other colours across it, you'll see how it will affect the colour underneath. It will either add more vibrancy, or it will deaden it, or it will change its colour totally. It's just quite fun to understand. And then you, like we were saying earlier, before the demo started, it's exploring and understanding the colours that you're using to get the most out of it. So I can say, oh, actually, I want this shade, but I don't know how to mix it. But if I glaze it, I'll probably get a better chance than I would mixing it. Similarly, like we were saying with this piece here, stick it in your paint, Barry. I needed that dark to start with, but by glazing over the top, it's still dark but softened. If I mixed that green with white, it would no longer be a dark green in the mist, it would be a soft green, and it would ruin the picture. So often it's best to just go dark, then glaze over the top, soften your work that way, because you've still got the strength of colour there. Any questions? No. It works, doesn't it? Actually, if we pass that round, Tony, if we pass that apple round,
So
then you can see.
correcting, if you have, like you say, you put in a colour and you think, oh God, that's not quite, so you can continue to glaze it until you get.
Absolutely. And oftentimes, if you glaze it with either a white or a complementary, it will soften or deaden or push back more than swirling colours frantically on your palette and shoving it on, and oh, that's not working, and then you get panicked, and then you get mud, and then it just doesn't work. Whereas a glaze is just like your best friend, really. It's sort of a way of softening or pushing back or what have you. And it's subtle. Incidentally, this is also a good way of beams of light in a woodland. You know, a white wash, drag down, and that will get you a beam of light. You can glaze with shadows. We did a watercolour once, a few months ago, where it was bright sunlight. So we painted all of the land in the normal colours, in the bright colour. Didn't put a single shadow on. We did a Cotswold village. And then we mixed up a purple shadow colour and glazed over where the shadows were, and you still get the colour underneath, but you get a shadow. So instead of with a woodland, you've got grass. Instead of making a dark green grass, which is a different colour, grass. Sorry, Charlotte, grass. You just do all the same colour green, and then you mix your purpley shadow colour over it, and that will darken the green. Instead of being a different green, it will just subdue the green and make it look like it's in shadow. So it does really make a difference. Glazing is perfect in watercolours, acrylics and oils. If you struggle with watercolour to glaze, you can't lighten with watercolour, but you can use pastels because it's semi-transparent. So I could push back, so it's not really a glaze. Oh, I'll show you with this, with watercolour. It's sort of how I get by with glazing. This is what we did in class yesterday. So I'll use some Rembrandt Artist Soft Pastels available from downstairs. And if I just get a white, find a clean finger. If I want to push these back, put a bit of pastel on my finger. That's why you've got to make sure your fingers are clean. If you wanted it really soft, you could put it right on there, but you do have to really push that in. But can you see how that's pushed that back? It's given me a lot more depth. And you could always rub it off with a putty rubber afterwards, but I've really pushed that into the fibre. But also, if I wanted a little bit more light, I could use a yellow pastel just to pick out the highlights. So it is then mixed media, but that don't matter anymore. It's the finished effect that works. And if you use the pastel in a subtle way, just to soften or just to bring back highlights, it works sort of like a glaze, because you're still getting the colour underneath, and the transparency of the pastel over the top does make a big difference. So even in watercolours you can do something, so you can't lose it totally. It's the same as the shadows. You could use a bit of pastel over the top if you wanted to. So the shadow on here in watercolour is a glaze. So it's I think it's the blue and burnt sienna. I think we use phthalo blue for this one with the burnt sienna, and in varying strengths, glazed over. You still see the colour of the beach shine through where you need it to. If I tried to use the shadow colour mixed with the beach colour, it would have gone green. And if I used a brown to make the shadow colour, it wouldn't look like a shadow colour. So by mixing the shadow and allowing the beach colour to dry first, and then glazing the grey over the top, or a purple, it depends on the light. Today it's a purpley grey because it's very sunny outside. But you could use a blue shadow, or a purple shadow, or a grey shadow, and glaze it over the top. It creates more harmony, and you're not adding another colour to the picture. You're creating tones within the picture through glazes. So there we go. Here endeth the lesson for the month. The next one is on Saturday the 1st of July, and it's all about buildings and perspective, the dreaded P word. So I'll be showing you simple ways of creating perspective then. So thank you very much.